Super. Thank you. Okay. So we'll look at these in somewhat of a chronological order, like going through the units. So one of the first cases we got introduced to was the McCulloch case. Things to know for the case are the parts of the Constitution that apply. And I would know the fact pattern because when you see that Supreme Court FRQ, you're probably going to have to recall somewhat of the facts as to what happened in the case. So McCulloch versus Maryland, again, that's the Bank of the United States case. The United States decides, hey, we want to found our own. Excuse me. We want to found our national bank for a variety of reasons. The state of Maryland hates the idea, and they're going to challenge that was an overstepping of federal authority, right? So this is a federalism case, right? The F word, it's a federalism case, clear cut. The two parts of the Constitution that come into play here are the Supremacy Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. Again, this is one of those cases that it has two applicable elements or amendments or constitutional clauses. Supremacy Clause, again, it states that if in the event that there's some sort of conflict between state and federal law, that federal law reigns superior. Okay, Necessary and Proper Clause or the Elastic Clause is what allows the government to stretch its powers. And so how these relate to the case is, again, Supreme Court is going to rule in favor of the United States government. They're going to allow the United States to create the national bank. The basis for that is going to be, again, that under the Necessary and Proper Clause, okay, that under the Necessary and Proper Clause, so if you're following along here on this handout that I've made, is that under that, the United States, that is a way for them to enforce their enumerated powers, right? Congress can print money, they can tax, they can do this. A bank would make sense. So under the Necessary and Proper Clause, the John Marshall Court rules that the bank can be created. The second part of the question is, can the states regulate that bank? Do they have the power to regulate it? And again, the answer to that question is no, is that if the states interfered with the operation of the bank, like how Maryland tried to tax the bank to death, that would be a violation of the Supremacy Clause. Okay. So again, deals with the bank. This is a federalism case that's going to extend powers back to the national government, giving the national government power to create the bank and not allowing the state of Maryland to interfere with its operation. Okay. Again, Supremacy Clause deals with the conflict between Maryland and the U.S. government as far as can Maryland regulate. Necessary and Proper Clause answers the question that yes, in order to carry out the enumerated powers of Congress, that the national government can in fact create a national bank. So again, we would view this federalism case, this McCulloch versus Maryland, again, early 1800s. This is a early win for the U.S. national government. Really quick, any questions on that? Just spit them out if you have them. Sounds like we're good. Okay, super. Next one, another federalism case. This is U.S. v. Lopez. Okay, so fact pattern with this, young man brings a gun to school. Again, we've said with this is that the College Board wants you to say Second Amendment. This is not a Second Amendment case. This is one looking at the Commerce Clause, right? Congress had passed the national law, the Gun-Free School Zone Act of America, abbreviated with the GFSA. Young man brings the gun to school. He gets in trouble. He's going to challenge that Congress, did not have power to pass this law because this is not commerce, right? Congress had said, hey, the Commerce Clause allows us to regulate commerce and trade between the several states. This Gun-Free School Zone Act it's constitutional under the sense that it falls under the Commerce Clause. Again, the Lopez family is going to challenge that. And that student is going to say, hey, actually, I don't believe the Gun-Free School Zone Act is constitutional. I don't believe Congress had the power to pass this law, and that this, in fact, is not commerce. If you remember correctly, does the Supreme Court rule in favor of the national government, or do they rule in favor of Lopez? Anybody remember?
Lopez.
Yeah, they rule in favor of Lopez. They say that this Gun-Free School Zone Act, in fact, does not fall under commerce. Okay, so this is kind of one of those things. It's viewed as, I guess, a win for the states. If you're thinking of federalism as that kind of that heavyweight boxing match that we had said in class, it's a win for the states. Now, again, all the states are going to pass laws banning firearms on school property, but Supreme Court said in this case, again, early 90s, that, in fact, this Gun-Free School Zone Act was not commerce, and that this was an overstepping of the congressional powers. Again, Congress, they like to use that commerce clause to gain more power. That's a historical fact. But in this case, the Supreme Court said that this Gun-Free School Zone Act is not commerce. Okay, so this is viewed as a, if you want, again, think of it as a boxing match, federalism, the relationship between the states and the national government, that this US v. Lopez, still my pick for the FRQ, which, by the way, all my other picks fell through. But again, this is viewed as a win for the states. Commerce clause, this is not Second Amendment. Okay, get that etched in your brain. So when you're 80 years old or 90 years old, and you're sitting at the retirement home, you can tell the people as you're playing pinochle, professor, that this is not a commerce, or excuse me, that this is not a Second Amendment case. This was the commerce clause. Okay, questions on Lopez? Again, it is not Second Amendment. We spent a good chunk of time in class discussing that. All right, so then we get into Bill of Rights stuff. Okay, and so our two cases that we'll look at, we'll kind of do them together here just for the sake of time, because we only have our 40 minutes on Zoom, is Engel versus Vitale and Wisconsin v. Yoder. Again, these two cases are similar in the sense that they examine that freedom of religion. Now, if you remember correctly, there's two clauses that we have to know with the freedom of religion. What are they? What are the two clauses?
Well, one of them is the Establishment Clause.
One of them is the Establishment Clause. You can probably see that on my screen. And Micah, I trust that you already knew that. What is the other one?
Free exercise clause.
Yeah, okay, I love that we're all yelling it. Yep, free exercise. So Engel versus Vitale, that is the Establishment Clause case. Okay, that's the Establishment Clause case. Wisconsin versus Yoder, the Amish school children case, that is free exercise. So in Engel and Vitale, it was New York Public Schools had asked the students to stand and voluntarily recite a prayer. We looked at that prayer in class, right? They did not use the name Jesus, but the phrase God was used. You have the family that's going to challenge, hey, like, the public school is an agent of the government. Even asking students to stand and voluntarily recite this prayer is endorsing a religion. Okay, it's endorsing a religion. Supreme Court rules in favor of the Vitale family or Engel family. However, and they say that this is a clear-cut violation of the Establishment Clause. It is not AP required, but this is a question I want an answer on this. When it comes to endorsing a religion in schools, there is a test that's established through a different Supreme Court case that is not a foundational one. Does anybody remember the name of that test? As like
Lemon?
It's the Lemon test. Very good. Yeah, it's the Lemon test. So that's not something that the AP says you're required to know, but I would kind of keep it in the back of your mind. The Lemon test is this a violation of the Establishment Clause? Is this endorsing a religion? Now, again, private schools can do that because they're private. Public schools cannot, again, endorse a religion. So in this case, even though it's a non-denominational prayer, Jesus was not used, the term God was. The school argues that, well, God is a universal term. Supreme Court says no, even asking the students to stand and do this is a clear-cut violation of this. Okay, Wisconsin v. Yoder. Yoder family, Amish in Wisconsin. They wanted to take their kids out of school after 8th grade. The state of Wisconsin, like many states, has the compulsory school attendance laws saying that you have to attend school until you're 16. The Yoder family says, hey, in our culture, our religion, we pull kids out of school at the age of 14 after 8th grade. We're pulling our kids out of school. Wisconsin obviously is going to challenge this, and they're going to say, hey, we have a state law. These kids have to attend until they're 16. Yoder family challenges, well, our religion, like a part of how we exercise our religion is we believe in pulling kids out of school at 14. Supreme Court, again, they're going to rule in favor of the Yoder family. Okay. They're going to rule in favor of the Yoder family, and they're going to say, hey, you know what? You're right. Okay. They cannot force you. That's a part of your free exercise thing. Okay. Your free exercise clause. All right. So again, we're not really getting a ton into this third column, but there is a third column, and I'll share this with you guys here when we're done here this evening. Okay. So again, 2 First Amendment cases. Again, since we're getting into some of these Bill of Rights things, it's important to remember that when the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights only protected people from who?
The government.
Okay, you gotta be more specific.
Federal government.
National government. Yes. The Bill of Rights, as it was written, only applied to protecting people from the national government. There is then this process through which the Bill of Rights is applied to the states. What's that process called?
Collective incorporation.
Collective incorporation, right? Due process clause of the 14th Amendment. The things found in the Bill of Rights, those are your civil liberties. Okay, so these freedom of religion cases, that's a civil liberty case. And again, eventually there is selective incorporation in which these protections are eventually applied against the state government. So getting into one of those here in a little bit. Another freedom of speech or freedom of expression, I guess. Tinker versus Des Moines. Again, this deals with the kids in Iowa. They wore their Vietnam armbands to school. The principal threatened to suspend them. Again, those armbands, anybody remember what they look like?
They were like a black armband with like a circle and a cross through Vietnam, I believe.
Yeah, and then there was a peace sign on them too, I believe. So nothing derogatory, right? Nothing that anybody would look at and say, all right, like this is super inappropriate, right? There wasn't any Effenheimers on there. There wasn't any, @ sign, double money sign. It was just no Vietnam. Like, let's get out of Vietnam, right? And Vietnam became a very unpopular war. But these Tinker students or the Tinker family students, they wear their armbands, they get suspended, and they're going to challenge that in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is going to rule in favor, and there's kind of our fact pattern. Supreme Court's going to rule in favor of the Tinkers. They said that the armbands did not cause a disruption in the school day. There was nothing super derogatory about them. Again, this case is going to protect students' political free speech in school. Okay. So again, another civil liberty case having to do with the freedom of political speech in school or freedom of political speech in general. Okay, so that's Tinker. Again, court rules in favor of the Tinker family, saying that the Des Moines school district was violating the students' rights by suspending them or even asking them to take the armbands off. Okay, now let's talk about this because again, we have said before that the Bill of Rights is not absolute. Okay, there's limitations to everything. Let's say those armbands did have an expletive word on them or some derogatory statements. Could that be classified? Like, would that speech still be protected? Probably not, right? Because again, that might cause a disruption. So that speech would be different. Again, these armbands were not derogatory in nature. Questions on Tinker or questions on these other couple First Amendment cases? Again, First Amendment's a big one. Includes our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, expression, right to assemble, the right to petition the government, so on and so forth. All right, continuing on then. Again, if you have questions, you have to stop me. Continuing on. So another freedom of speech case, in this case, freedom of the press, is the New York Times case. Term to remember with this one is prior restraint. Okay, and prior restraint is the government's power to block information from being published that could cause some sort of national security threat or national security risk. In this case, the New York Times had gained access to the Pentagon Papers. Again, the Pentagon Papers were classified documents that more or less pointed out that the United States had a bigger involvement in the Vietnam War than what they had led people on to believe. So the New York Times, the Washington Post, they get their fingers on these. They want to publish them. President Nixon asks for the blockage of that publication based on prior restraint. And so there's your fact pattern. Anybody remember, how does the Supreme Court rule on this one?
In favor of the New York Times.
They rule in favor of the New York Times, right? They say that the press serves the governed, not the governors. The Pentagon Papers get published. Again, this is a freedom of press case involving the idea or the power of prior restraint. The government says, again, press serves the governed, not the governors. Papers can be published. This is a free speech win or a freedom of press win for our journalists. Okay, so the New York Times, again, another First Amendment case. And then our last of the First Amendments is we have Schenck. Okay, right? This is the clear and present danger case. What was Mr. Schenck doing?
He was publishing anti-war pamphlets, discouraging men from joining.
Right. He was asking men not to join the draft. Okay. So this is one of the First Amendment cases. It's the only First Amendment case of the required ones that you have to know where the government or where the Supreme Court, pardon me, where the Supreme Court is actually going to rule in favor of the national government, right? You have Charles Schenck circulating the information, encouraging people to dodge the draft. Again, he was also a known socialist, which being a socialist is not a crime, right? That's like a freedom of expression, a freedom of thought thing. So that on its own, even though it is frowned upon, I guess, in the United States, it's not illegal. Okay. But nonetheless, Charles Schenck circulates his pamphlet. Supreme Court says, hey, this is causing a national security risk. And this establishes that clear and present danger test that you cannot walk into the theater and you cannot yell fire because it would cause a panic. So the Supreme Court says this is a similar thing, and that what Mr. Schenck was doing, circulating these pamphlets, was not protected speech. Okay. He cannot circulate the pamphlets. He argues First Amendment right. Supreme Court says no. If we have young men that read these things and dodge the draft, that creates a major risk for the U.S. national security and the war effort. And so therefore the speech is not protected. Kind of a big historical theme, maybe to understand with this too, is that generally during war times is that the government starts to crack down and really limit what can be said, what can be circulated. We see the same thing happen during World War II. We saw the same thing happen, I guess to some extent with like Vietnam. We talk about the Tinker case and the New York Times case, both dealing with Vietnam. But during war times, the government really does try to kind of, I guess, crack the whip, so to speak, and limit that freedom of speech, those First Amendment rights. Okay. Again, you have to know clear and present danger. What Charles Schenck was doing was not protected speech because it created a national security threat. So this, again, not protected speech. Understand what the clear and present danger test is. There's a rumor on the street, and this will not affect you guys, but that this case next year might not be a required one. Their AP is looking at changing some cases around, and the case they're going to ask kids to know, I think, for next year is the Brandenburg versus Ohio case involving the Ku Klux Klan. But anyways, you have to know Schenck. Questions on Schenck? No questions. All right, Gucci. Moving along. We get into a selective incorporation case here. This is Andy Meyer's favorite case. Andy, what's the phrase with Gideon?
So a Florida man walks into a bar.
Yep, just how any good story starts. A Florida man walks into a bar, right? Clarence Gideon, a homeless guy for all intents and purposes, breaks into and I use the term break in very loosely, but he walks into a closed pool hall in Florida. Steals some quarters out of the jukebox, steals a couple bottles of wine, and goes and has himself a 2-bottle of wine party. Again, Charles Schenck did not have much of an education whatsoever. He gets arrested for burglarizing, for stealing, whatever. And the way that the cops even kind of came about arresting him was fishy in the first place, because there were some eyewitnesses that said, yeah, it was this guy or this guy or whatever. And he kind of just gets blamed for it. But Schenck, right? This is a Sixth Amendment case. The part of the Sixth Amendment that you have to know for this one is the right to counsel. Again, the Sixth Amendment, kind of like the First Amendment, there's a bunch of parts to it: fair and speedy trial, right to counsel, right to hear and question witnesses, right to see evidence, so on and so forth. But the right of counsel is a Sixth Amendment protection. So when Gideon is arraigned, he asks for counsel. The state of Florida, do they give him counsel? The answer is
No.
Nope. They said this is not a capital case. In the state of Florida, we only grant counsel for like murder cases involving the death penalty. No counsel for you, Mr. Gideon. He challenges it in the Supreme Court and he says, hey, like, I want my counsel. Okay, I want my counsel. Supreme Court agrees with them. Okay, they agree with them. They said, hey, you have the right to that. Supreme Court rules in favor of Gideon, thus selectively incorporating the right to counsel to the states. Okay, again, Florida man walks into a bar. This is a selective incorporation case, applying that Sixth Amendment protection back to the states. Understand, again, civil liberties here, civil liberties, Bill of Rights, civil liberties, 14th Amendment due process clause. That's what's used for selective incorporation, saying that if we did not give the Florida man his attorney, that we would be violating his due process of law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment as a citizen of the United States. So this is one of two selective incorporation cases that you have to know. Again, that protection being extended back to the states. The other one is McDonald versus Chicago. Now, Roe v. Wade is the abortion case, dealing with a women's right to privacy. It deals with a bunch of different amendments. This is the one that the AP has promised will not appear on the test since the new ruling has come down. Again, that's maybe another big idea to understand, probably more of a unit 2 thing, but understanding that the only way the Supreme Court can change a precedent is to have a similar case, rule on it differently, like they recently did this past summer. But again, in the past, Roe v. Wade has been required. AP has said that it will not be this time around. However, again, it encompassed a bunch of different things, including the 14th Amendment, First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and the Ninth Amendment, right? The wild card amendment saying that you have more rights than just those listed in the Constitution. So we're going to leave that one alone for now, but I don't know, maybe keep it in the back of your mind in case the AP lies, which there's a chance they do. Oh, while we're on topic here, did anybody watch the State of the Union last night?
Was that a basketball game?
Me too. There's recordings, Micah. I know you're a big YouTube guy.
I watched like the rebuttal.
There you watched the oppositional response.
Yeah.
Okay. So Sarah Huckabee, governor of Arkansas, my understanding is who gave it for the Republicans. My plan when we're done here tonight is to watch those things. I got them queued up here on my TV. So as soon as we're done reviewing AP, I'm going to nerd out and do a little State of the Union, a little oppositional response and see what's what. But again, that's a Constitution thing. President says in the Constitution has to do it from time to time, and it's turned into every year. Okay. Moving along here and kind of going quick because we have, again, as you can see, a few more here to cover, and we got about 12 minutes. McDonald versus Chicago, Second Amendment case, right to bear arms. Again, it's similar to the DC versus Heller case, but this one is going to apply the right to bear arms back to the states. 14th Amendment, due process clause, selective incorporation. Again, the city of Chicago had some of the toughest gun ownerships in the country, specifically with handguns. And Mr. McDonald's going to challenge that. Supreme Court 5-4 decision rules in favor of McDonald. The case that if you were to see this one, say like in the Supreme Court FRQ, does anybody remember the case that they might try to compare this to? Similar ruling, but different because it did not involve a U.S. state.
DC versus Heller or Keller.
Right. Yeah, Heller, DC versus Heller. And the Supreme Court in DC versus Heller, it's the same outcome involving basically the same question about gun ownership rights. But again, DC versus Heller does not selectively incorporate that part of the Second Amendment because the District of Columbia is not a state. So these two cases happen in relatively close proximity of one another as far as like the general timeline. But again, understand DC versus Heller is not selective incorporation. I could see the AP asking some sort of question about how they're different. And that's what you would have to write about is that DC, even though the rulings of the case are basically identical, DC is not a state. Thus, it did not selectively incorporate the Second Amendment. Chicago's a part of the state of Illinois. And that's where the selective incorporation bit comes. Okay. Zoom is telling me here that we got 10 minutes. So we're going to go rapid fire here. Okay. So again, there you have DC versus Heller. Brown v. Board. Again, this is a civil rights case. Again, difference between civil rights and civil liberties. Civil liberties are the ones found in the Bill of Rights. Don't confuse the two. Okay. Civil liberties found in the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, right to bear arms, right from protection from unreasonable searches and seizures, so on and so forth. Okay. Brown v. Board deals with the question of racial segregation. This is a civil rights case, right? Civil rights, laws, court rulings that aim to extend similar rights to people who have historically been discriminated against. In this case, African Americans. So Brown v. Board, it deals not with the due process clause. It deals with the other clause in the 14th Amendment. What's that one called?
Equal protection.
Protection clause. Very good, right? Linda Brown wants to go to the school near her house. It was a whites only school. Dad challenges it. Unanimous decision. Supreme Court says, hey, that in fact, segregation was not separate but equal, and that segregating public schools was a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Okay. Then there's a Brown v. Board of Education Part 2 later on, where the court has to decide how do we go about ending segregation in public spaces. But again, Brown v. Board, Equal Protection Clause, dealing with segregation in the schools. Okay. The last one, or one of the last ones here that we get into, is Citizens United. Again, that we'll spend more time on this later, but this has to do with political contributions. Okay. And that political contributions are free speech. You have the Citizens United group, a conservative group. They wanted to, I guess they wanted to air the Hillary movie that would have bashed Hillary Clinton, maybe, I don't know, ruined her political reputation going into the presidential primaries. The FEC, which again, campaign laws are confusing. The FEC is our Federal Election Commission, right? A part of our federal bureaucracy that has the job of overseeing some of these election laws. Again, we have the fact pattern, right? They wanted to produce their movie about Hillary Clinton. Controversy over if that violated BICRA. Again, BICRA was the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, dealing with political contributions of like corporations, labor unions, whatever. Citizens United challenged that if they were not allowed to broadcast their movie, that violated their free speech. Again, there's a lot of moving parts of Citizens United. But if you remember that the Supreme Court more or less says, again, it's a split decision, 5-4, they rule in favor of Citizens United. They say that, you know, super PACs can give, you know, unlimited amounts of money only if those monies do not go directly to a campaign, which again, Citizens United was not tied with anybody's campaign directly, which means that they could, you know, spend as much money as they wanted against their political opponents, as long as that money does not go to any specific campaign, right? There's still limitations on monies going right to a campaign. But again, super PACs, they can spend as much money as they want now, right? That these large corporations, these interest groups like a Citizens United, that they enjoy a free speech, and that political contributions are a form of free speech. This question did appear in the SCOTUS FRQ last year. It did appear last year. The AP wanted very specifically, I would maybe write this down, those of you that are taking notes right now, political free speech. Okay, that these campaign, that this money being spent by the super PACs like a Citizens United, that those contributions are a form of, again, free speech should get you the point, but they wanted, in the grading thing that they sent out later, political free speech tied to financial contributions with super PACs. Okay, so that's Citizens United. All right, we then get into our two gerrymandering cases, Baker v. Carr, Shaw versus Reno. Baker v. Carr, again, both of these gerrymandering cases apply to the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. Gerrymandering, it affects which house of Congress, the House or the Senate?
The House.
Only the House, because again, the House is based on population. We then have congressional districts. Gerrymandering is when those districts get drawn in funny shapes for political reasons. Okay, we'll leave it at that for now. But in Baker v. Carr, this deals with the state of Tennessee. They had not redrawn their districts in a long time. There was one district that had much fewer people than another district. And so it was challenged that, hey, those districts need to be mostly equal in population size. Otherwise, those voters where there's not as many of them, their vote would count more than somebody else's. And the Supreme Court is going to agree. They said that, hey, you know what, Tennessee, we have the power to force you to redraw your districts. The precedent that comes out of this, and I will add it to here if I can. This is the idea of one person, one vote. Okay. The idea that we cannot have districts that are overpopulated or have a substantially less population than another. Again, that's like the one thing, one of the very few things the Supreme Court has been consistent on with gerrymandering, is that the districts have to be relatively equal. Again, it's hard to make them perfectly equal, but relatively equal in population size. But again, gerrymandering occurs, you know, to give the advantage to certain political parties or certain groups of people. In this case, Supreme Court says, hey, Tennessee, you got to redraw these things. And they got to be substantially equal in population, one person, one vote. Okay. Shaw versus Reno, similar, I guess. but this deals with minor or majority minority districts. North Carolina had drawn a district that would have given a substantial amount of power to African-American voters. Okay, it gets challenged that, hey, this 12th district, I remember we looked at it in class, that it was drawn in a way to really give power to African-Americans so that they could elect perhaps an African-American representative to Congress. The Supreme Court is going to say, hey, you can't do that. That districts cannot be drawn based solely on race. Okay. And that's another thing the Supreme Court has said. However, where this gets to be confusing is when it comes to district drawing, is the Supreme Court has also said that race can be a factor, which what the heck does that mean? So race can be a factor, but the districts can't be based solely on race. So wrap your minds around that. But that's Baker, that's Shaw versus Reno. My fault. Shaw versus Reno, majority minority districts. Okay. And then probably the most important case of them all, very early Supreme Court case, Johnny Marshall Court, Marbury versus Madison. Here we go. It establishes the most important power of our judicial branch in the power of judicial review. Somebody other than Andy or Micah, Owen Wiersma, I choose you. Power of judicial review. What is it? You got a minute.
The power of the judiciary branch to review things.
Okay, great. Thank you for using the terminology. I appreciate you, Owen. Red Rover. I call Kemper Pearson over. Kemper Pearson, judicial review. Can you elaborate further on that?
Judicial review.
Power of the court to rule laws or actions to be fill in the blank.
Unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional.
Got
Hey,
it.
that was Kemper's question, dude.
I popcorned in. Sorry, I popcorned in.
And here, okay, celebrity shot there. Celebrity shot, no problem. But that's, again, judicial review is alluded to in Fed 78. It's not included in the Constitution, though. But judicial review is established by Marbury versus Madison, right? William Marbury was one of John Adams' midnight judges, right? John Adams had lost the election to Jefferson. He appoints a bunch of judges late into the night, hence the midnight judges, wants to get those commissions delivered. Marbury, again, was very salty that his commission didn't get delivered. He asked the court to issue what's called a writ of mandamus or mandamus, asked him to deliver this writ of mandamus that would have forced James Madison, the Secretary of State at the time, to deliver his commission. Okay. Don't over confuse this. John Marshall actually says that, hey, Marbury, you're entitled to that commission, but I have no power to enforce this. I have no power to force Madison to do this. This early Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional because the court doesn't have the power to actually enforce it, thus establishing the power of judicial review. Okay. So that's that is the important thing here with that. Okay. Questions there.